All right. So today we're going to talk about human trafficking, and I partnered with the East River Human Trafficking Task Force of South Dakota as part of Safe Place of Eastern South Dakota in Mitchell. We're part of their team, and we are part of the community outreach for the East River Human Trafficking Task Force. So some of the materials in here are from them. So my name is Colleen Hoffman, and I'm the program manager here at Safe Place of Eastern South Dakota in Mitchell. We cover an 8-county radius. So we travel all the way up to like Weston Springs, over to the Freeman, Menno area. We go into Howard, over to Armour, Corsica, and then also into White Lake. So that's kind of like an overview of our coverage area. This presentation is supported by the Office of Violence Against Women. It's a grant that Safe Place received, and it's called our Prevention Grant. So with that, there's always things that we have. So Cheyenne is helpful in passing out all of our information about surveys. You can fill them out when you are all done, and she's recording these presentations for us as well. I just want to let you know that we are not experts in human trafficking, but we can just bring the years of experience and knowledge of the work as we present these materials and tools to you. So today we're going to talk about defining what human trafficking is. We are going to talk about the different types of human trafficking, an overview of like how trafficking happens. I did put in a couple case studies that we'll look at to look at what the act and the means was of the trafficking. We'll look at potential indicators and some considerations to look at, touch on the statistics here in South Dakota and some of the statutes, let you know how to help someone, and then resources that are available in South Dakota. Human trafficking. Human trafficking is defined or involves that use of force, fraud, or coercion to try to obtain some type of either labor or commercial sex act. Every year, millions of men and women and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in South Dakota. Towards the end of the presentation, I do have numbers on what it looks like in South Dakota. It can happen in any community, and victims can be of any age, race, gender, or nationality. Traffickers might use manipulation or false promise of preying on someone through maybe their job or romantic relationship to try to lure that victim into the trafficking world. So what is human trafficking? Like we talked about in the previous slide, it's that exploitation of a person for either commercial sex or labor against their will, and they use means of force, fraud, or coercion. There is an exception to the force, fraud, or coercion, especially when it comes to children participating in commercial sex activities. This is always considered trafficking. There is no such thing under federal law as child prostitution. Like we said, according to the Department of Homeland Security, human trafficking involves that force, fraud, and coercion, and we're going to go into each one of those so you have a better idea of what that looks like. According to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, it defines sex trafficking as recruiting or harboring, transporting, or obtaining or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And in labor trafficking, it is that recruitment, harboring, but this one here is obtaining a person for labor of services through the use of the force, fraud, and coercion. So when we look at force, it is monitoring, and that confinement is often used to control the victim, especially during the early stages of victimization, to break down the victim's resistance. So what they would do is this this force of, beating, abuse, rape, confinement, kidnapping, doing type of like initiations to get them to do what they want to do, that force upon another person. Fraud, over time, there might be unexpected changes in work conditions, compensation. There might be a debt agreement or a nature of the relationship. So this could look like false promises in relationships, maybe withholding some of that funding that's coming into the house for jobs. It could be withholding those wages. And a lot of this could also be blackmail or extortion of another person. When it comes to coercion, it's a lot of like that intimidation, humiliation, looking at threatening abuse of maybe like the legal process that's happening, controlling the daily life skills, establishing, especially if they're going out and doing the sex trafficking, maybe establishing some of the quotas. We talked about the two different trafficking. So there's labor trafficking and there's sex trafficking. When we're looking especially into the labor trafficking, it's the exploitation in which individuals are forced to do that labor of service. And that could look like sweatshops, agricultural work, especially in our area. It could look at sales. It could look at restaurants, food service industries. The other thing that we could look at too is armed services. The other one is the sex trafficking, and that we talked about is exploitation in which someone is forced to perform that commercial sex through that force, fraud, and coercion. A lot of this would be out of bars or clubs. This is where the prostitution, the stripping, you see a lot of maybe hotel motels when they're shifting from one hotel to another. We'll talk about those. And then forced marriages. So what are the indicators? How can we see that it's either maybe labor trafficking or sex trafficking? So in labor trafficking, it's more of, like we said, that forced confinement and that assault when a worker doesn't comply or understand the job expectations. And fraud, it can look like them withholding some of the documentations for them or anything that maybe offers them a better life. Coercion is like that threat of harm or resisting, threatening of that they're going to get them deployed, make them feel like they're the shame and fear that they're going to maybe share some information or report them. When it comes to sex trafficking, we talk a lot about, especially with the force, the rape, the beating, kidnapping, and fraud. It's like that false employment or marriage, saying that they're going to have a better life. When it comes to trafficking, they know who they are targeting. They want to groom them and do some of that in recruitment. Coercion is a threats of serious harm or physical to an individual or anyone that maybe cares about, or the intent to instill that fear in a psychological or manipulative way. Human trafficking occurs when a perpetrator often refers to as a trafficker. So they have an action, they have a means, and they have a purpose. So the action then employs that means of force. And then we talk about that fraud or coercion for that purpose of the victim to either provide that sexual act or the labor for services. We'll look a little bit more into this. This is actually called the AMP model. So it's really talking about the action. So what is done? What is done to that other person and able to get them into this trafficking world? So they may be doing some recruitment. They might be harboring someone, being able to get them into this life. There's the means. So how is it done? So how is it done? We talked about that: force, fraud, or coercion. And then why it's done. It's either done for, like we said, the commercial sex, or for the labor and services. So trafficking doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of this whole economic system of criminality. So understanding that human trafficking is one way that resembles the story of how this is being done. So you have the trafficker. The trafficker is going to provide this service, this victim, who is going to provide, like we said, either that sexual act or is going to be providing that labor. And then you have that buyer or that seller, that person who's going to obtain this person either by money or selling stuff in order to be able to get the means for this victim. So who are traffickers? Often traffickers and their victims share kind of that same either nationality or cultural background with their victim. Pimps and traffickers try hard to get a victim to appear as if they have run away from their home. This is especially with when we'll talk about like gangs and organized crimes, but they do their recruitment younger and younger, and that's where they will use where they're appearing that they're actually a runaway and not someone that they are trafficking. Traffickers are experts at making promises aimed at addressing the needs their target in order to impose that control. And traffickers are part of that larger criminal activity, which we will look at. I broke it down into the different types of traffickers that could be in these areas and how they would do their recruitment or their act and means to be able to get victims into their trafficking world. We'll talk about the families, friends, and acquaintances. We'll talk about even intimate partner. We talk a little bit later about the correlation of domestic violence and human trafficking and how to identify that. We'll talk about what employers do, talk about the organized crimes and gangs, and touch a little bit on landlords. So friends, families, and acquaintances. Traffickers can be perpetrated by a family member, friend, and acquaintance. They can do this by exploiting that victim, especially if they're under a lot of economic stress. And it could be a part of that continuing cycle of violence that we talked about in the domestic violence presentation. Intimate partner, I have in a couple slides here that will look at the human trafficking power and control wheel, but with intimate partners, they will use that intimacy as part of that tool to maintain them or try to get them in, especially like we talked about those false marriages, bringing, someone into a relationship under false pretenses in order to be able to do that recruitment and that pimping out of their partner. Employers, they'll withhold wages, they'll isolate the workers, bring them into poor working conditions. There was a case study where there's a young man in Thailand with his wife and young children, and he applied for a job through this recruiting agency. So what they were doing was subcontracting to find skilled workers to come to the United States. So after he arrived to the United States, he was informed that he would not be working as a welder, that he would actually be working in a different line of work. And with that, when they got him here, they confiscated his visa and passport and then forced him to work long hours for little pay. So that kind of talks a little bit about how someone as an employer could get them here under false pretenses. Organized crimes, traffickers use this to bring victims into the trafficking world. They'll force them to participate in these illegal activities. With gangs, they do the gang recruitment, and I talked earlier about how they started at a young age, and they use that means of this young one was running away. I'm here to save them, because a lot of times when we have at risk, they're looking for that social acceptance. So if it looks like this is going to be, great to get into because I might get new shoes, or they're going to get me, a new cell phone or laptop, it's something that they can easily get hooked into, and the traffickers will prey on that. Landlords, they have the controlling house situation where threaten to evict them. I know we've had a case here that we've worked here at Safe Place where they were seeking shelter because the landlord was, instead of paying rent, the landlord forced them to do things against their will in order to live there, basically, quote unquote, for free. So what does labor trafficking look like? I have a case for labor trafficking and for sex trafficking, but this one is specifically for labor trafficking. So we have Jose here. He was only 15 when he was brought illegally into the country by his father to work and support their family back in Guatemala. He worked for a restaurant where his father was a general manager. So Jose was working 6 days a week for 12 hours per day, making only around 300 per week. The little money that Jose made, he sent home to his mom and siblings. So one day when Jose was 18, the restaurant owner accused Jose of stealing and assaulted him in the community. They threatened Jose that if he talked or left his job, that they would call ICE and have him deported. So after Jose reported the assault to the law enforcement, more was revealed about Jose's unfit, harsh working living conditions, and a community support provider stepped in to help provide that safe housing, food, and access to that legal support. And an investigation was taken place in regards to this, and they were charged with trafficking. So what were the key elements of the trafficking? What did we see in there that showed that this was a labor trafficking piece that was happening? So some of the things that we saw in this story with Jose is they brought him into the country illegally. He was brought here illegally by his father. And with that, they paid him little to nothing for the work that he was doing. And then later on, we saw that they were accusing him of stealing, and then they assaulted him. And then after that, they threatened then to have him fired and deported. So we see what I'll go back to the previous slide. So we see what the act was. The act was that he would be coming here to work to help his family. But what had happened is that he was overworked for little amount of money, and that he was threatened. His job was threatened, that they were going to take away his job and then end up deporting him. So he was very scared on what would happen. So with this, at least he got some support from a community support provider to help him with those needs that he needed to be able to survive. So what does sex trafficking look like? Here is a case study that was actually from South Dakota. We have Amy. Amy was dancing for men since she was 13. She grew up in South Dakota and was raised by her alcoholic grandmother because her mother was in jail, in and out of jail, and addicted to drugs. Her grandmother was the next best option. Amy was a runaway frequently and constantly seeking attention from older men because it made her feel valued and loved. So we're fast forwarding now to her adult life. She found herself in relationships with men that would force her to sleep with them across multiple states and for money, including Wyoming, Iowa, and Minnesota, to name a few. She felt trapped, like she had to stay with him because she was never taught those life skills on like how to hold a job or provide for herself. So she had the opportunity to get away, but knew that she couldn't survive on her own and was continuing to be threatened by her trafficker if she left. She did find herself as a 22-year-old single mom of two by two different fathers, relying on her traffickers for support. It wasn't until she reached out to an old friend and vented to her about what was going on, that she didn't have enough money and wanted out of the lifestyle, that her friend told her to get help, and connected her to those services. So with this, the key elements of trafficking was, at the beginning, we saw that she ran away frequently. She was seeking that attention from older men, so that trafficker played on those and groomed her throughout this process and had her hooked into that system, because then she found herself in a relationship with a man who forced himself on her and pimped her out for all of this money, and she felt trapped and she couldn't get away because he was providing that for her. So she was feeling threatened. It wasn't until her friend she vented to was able to find that help. And that's why it's so important that we at least give you the background of what human trafficking looks like and what to look for, so that you can help a friend, family member, or coworker get out of this system. So what keeps them in the life? We had two case studies where we saw the reasons of that fear. They had that they were threatened either by, like in the first case, he was threatened that he was going to lose his job, that he was going to get deported. And in the second story, it was that fear of, if she leaves this, she won't have any money to be able to take care, because she just didn't have those life skills. Dependency, we saw both of them were dependent. I mean, the one was dependent for making money for his family. The other one was dependent on having that money and resources to be able to provide for her children. And then we have that psychological factors where they agreed to do something, and that this is my choice, when really they know that with education and understanding that it is not their fault, that we want to let them know that there are resources out there so they don't feel trapped. There are, in human trafficking, there are vulnerabilities. There are populations that are at risk or increased risk for trafficking. In these groups, I kind of coupled them all together so you could see that, but each one of them have their own indicated risk factors for trafficking. We saw in the two previous case studies, the one that we had was immigration. The other one was we're talking about with their life experiences and being in that homelessness and that running away. There was some substance use that was going on in that family. When there's the youth that are disconnected, that was another thing too. She was disconnected from her family. And like I said, there was some cases that we had where there was workers from the hotel motels. And in our area, a lot of the times we'll see where we have that migrant or seasonal workers, especially in the agricultural. I talked about that power and control wheel. Here is the power and control wheel for our sex and labor trafficking. Very, very familiar to what it looks like as far as our domestic violence and that power and control. They will be using that privilege, that economic, especially, you know, when they are taking their money or threatening their jobs, intimidation, a lot of that emotional abuse, confining that victim, making them scared that they have no other choice, isolating them from things that they like to do, or moving them into different locations, like with the case study with the sexual exploitation. He moved her from different states. The denying, minimizing, blaming, feeling like I can't get out, it's my fault. The sexual abuse that happened in the one, and then the physical with the labor trafficking case that we had. and the barriers. What prevents that someone from getting out or disclosing? A lot of times it's that lack of awareness that what they're experiencing is trafficking. They may not understand that that's what it is. Even knowing what their legal rights are, the lack of the identification and records. The one gentleman coming here, his paperwork and stuff was taken as soon as he got to the US. That fear of being deported or even fear of law enforcement. They don't want to get that other person in trouble. They don't want to feel like they're going to get in trouble. So that's why they have the fear of reporting could lead to something that would be happening. Feel that it's an illegal act, that they're going to get in trouble, so they don't want to report. Fears that the trafficker will cause more harm to them, their family, or their loved ones. Having that limited education hinders them from being able to communicate what they want to get across of what's happening. And they experience that trauma bonding with that trafficker or other victims that are in the system. Distrust of providers or even distrust of authority, feeling that hopelessness, and of course that guilt and shame of being in the trafficking world. So for us, as advocates, we were trained by Call to Freedom. They came down and did human trafficking training for us and talked about identifiers and how we can identify someone that's being trafficked versus some of the things that are happening on the outside, what human trafficking looks like. I'll show you the correlation of what a DV case and trafficking case looks like. We also talk about there's the mental health or addiction crisis. There might be a correlation of the child abuse. There might be something more happening, that homelessness or the prostitution or that formed crimes that happen. Here's an example that we have for DV and human trafficking. So in this case, we have Nick and Brittany. They were married. Within a year of their dating, he started to physically assault her when he drank. Nick would bring Brittany to and from work and wouldn't allow her to leave the house until he approved of her outfits. He became jealous and he would show up at Brittany's place of employment unannounced, causing her to lose her job. Brittany was told that losing her job was unexpected and she didn't need to find a way to pay her bills, or that she didn't need to find that. So he provided an opportunity, as he said, to invite his friends over and told Brittany to wear something provocative and demanded that she make money. So Brittany had no other options and complied and had sex with these men for money. So my question is, after learning about the force, coercion, and threat, and this act, this means of trafficking, what in here can we pick out that it goes from domestic violence to the trafficking piece? You want to put it in the chat or unmute yourself to answer. Does anybody have any identifiers that they can see? Yes, when he provided her the opportunity to make money. Yeah, right there. That's where that trafficking started in that relationship. So we can see it started off as domestic violence, where we have that he was controlling her and physically assaulting her, that isolation and picking out those, approving those outfits before she left the house. So at the end, she feels like she is trapped now and has no other option but to comply. This quote was from Mary. She's actually a survivor of labor and trafficking, and she grew up in Sioux Falls, and she's done a number of speaking engagements for Call to Freedom. And if you have not heard her speak, I recommend you listen to her story. This is a quote that she talks about, especially when it comes to domestic violence. Domestic violence is not always connected to trafficking, but trafficking is always connected with domestic violence. The person we love, trust, and is our family is the person doing this to us. This is our family, which is not always blood. Can be our husband, boyfriend, family member, or so-called new family. To think domestic violence doesn't correlate with human trafficking is simply incorrect. It is one of the ways to get us into the life and to the cycle of abuse. So potential indicators, we're going to talk about a lot of indicators that we can look for and consider that someone is being trafficked. So we have the general indicators. So when you're looking at someone, they might talk about things that are happening and it sounds very scripted, or they're not in control of their documents. Like we talked about the one case study, he had all of this stuff taken away. They may have that memory lapse. We talk about trauma, especially with our DV and going through the traumas. Not when we look at it, as they're not going to be able to put all those pieces back together that they had before they came into this system of trafficking. And maybe lives in that substandard conditions with a lot of multiple people. So these are some general indicators that we can look at to identify someone is in the trafficking system. Relationship, we talk about the intimate partner, isolation from that support system. Minors, they have difficulty clarifying who their legal guardian is or who they live with. That's a big thing. So in a smaller community, you usually know who their guardian or their parent is. If you see a child with someone that is not of their guardian and their child isn't able to identify it, then you know that's a red flag. And then the interest with being in a relationship with someone that's much older. Workplace, so if you have someone in the workplace that you're concerned about, these are some of the indicators that you can look for: working long hours or unusual hours, having that restriction in that workplace, transportation is controlled. We could go back into that DV case where that person was controlling them and bringing them to and from work. Unusual activities, working like odd hours in the day or even in the night. Health indicators, a lot of times just that lack of that basic medical care for themselves or hygiene. Maybe they were denied medical services, so they don't know where to get those services or even had those services done. Struggles with addictions, substance use. They're very fearful, appearing withdrawal, and sometimes they'll have that self-harm or those suicidal ideations. Here's some things to consider, especially with their living conditions. Lives where they work, maybe lives in frequent hotel motels. The living conditions constantly are changing. There's no privacy to any of the living conditions that they're in. They may live with multiple of people. The employer rents or owns that living quarters. Like I talked about in the case that we dealt with, the landlord was not charging them rent, but having them do things in order for them to live there for free. And then the limited ability to making any house decisions, especially in your relationships. Financial indicators, if they have little or no access to finances, they have that increased large amount of debt that it's impossible for them to pay off. They may have little pay or no pay at all. or unexplained access to money and unexplained purchases. Like we talked about with that recruitment, we talked about it looks good if they're getting like a brand new pair of shoes or a cell phone, or they have lots of new clothing that they have. So what is happening here? Traffickers like to work underground. They don't necessarily want to be in those big, cities to do their work. They're drawn to small communities, small towns like us, because they feel that they won't get caught. So areas that have a lot of agricultural farming, which is South Dakota, areas that have a lot of law enforcement do not have a lot of law enforcement on patrol. These are the areas that are always breeding grounds for traffickers. Traffickers know that, and they want to do some of their work here. So the types of trafficking that we have here in South Dakota are the events. So my question to you is, what events in South Dakota draw traffickers to our area? What are some big things that we have in South Dakota that would be bringing in a lot of these behaviors for traffickers? Yes. Number one is the Sturgis Rally. What would be number two?
I was gonna guess like the pheasant hunting season.
Yes. Yep. The hunting season is the other one that is the biggest one that we have here in South Dakota. Another one that they have is not just specifically for South Dakota, but another high time is your Super Bowl. And then familia or family, who would be the ones that would be the high trafficking people in your family? We kind of talked about it. It might be in that relationship with your partner. It could be your parent. It could be your grandparent. It could also be your sibling, or maybe even an aunt or an uncle. Yes, boyfriend too. Acquaintances can get you into this line of work, as we saw in the previous case where she was in that dating relationship with her boyfriend and he ended pimping her out for sex. Yes, it also could be step parents or other people that are close to your family. Gang related, we talk about the cartel, there'd be street gangs, and even some of those organized crimes as well. So with our South Dakota statistics, I've got some of these from Call to Freedom. I also have some national statistics too. I'll talk about some of our statistics that we see here at Safe Place. But here, trafficking related calls, these were the ones that came from Call to Freedom. They had 636 calls. Of course, that it has risen. In 2018, South Dakota was reported the 11th in the US for the number of active criminal human trafficking cases that went through the federal courts. 8 life sentences, that was year to date. That was the most of any other state. And we had a total of 80 federal cases in South Dakota. In 2019, 11 people were arrested at the Sturgis Rally sting, and all of them were actually South Dakota residents. And in 2020, 8 people were arrested and 6 were South Dakota residents. Here in Mitchell, at the Safe Place, at our domestic violence shelter, when Call to Freedom came and did their training with us, we ended up seeing, they came and did the training with us in November. They came back 6 months later, and they ended up seeing 5 cases of human trafficking in our area in that short amount of time, and 3 of them came from our domestic violence shelter. Over the past 3 years, we've averaged around 7 to 6 victims of human trafficking in our Mitchell area. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, this is the data that they have reported for South Dakota in 2021. The following information is based on kind of those incoming calls or communications that they have with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. This data is from January 1st to December 31st, but these are all about human trafficking cases or issues related to human trafficking in South Dakota. So these are all the different forms of communication that they get. They have their crisis hotline, which I'll give that number to you. I also left the website down at the bottom for you to go and look at more research. They have text messages that they can do. So they had 9 of those. They also have an online feature where they have the web chat too. So they had 1 of those and 4 web chats, and they also receive emails as well. So I put in the statutes. You can go in and look at the statutes as well. But Governor Noem, she had legislative take a 4-prong approach to be able to protect South Dakota from human trafficking. And these were the ones that have been put into place. So one is the ensuring that traffickers are prosecuted for their crimes. We want to make sure that we're paving a path to clear records, especially for minors with convictions, especially if they've been forced into this, like selling of drugs or the substance use, or maybe they were threatened to steal. That's where we want to make sure that they get a clean record, and increasing that access to victim resources, including maybe reimbursement of expenses if they had to go to the hospital or they've received counseling. And then that CPS jurisdiction by categorizing those. And we have all of those laws into effect. You can look those up in the South Dakota codified laws. So how can we help a human trafficking victim? One thing to do is provide them that privacy. Discuss with them what's been going on, how everything has been going, and just let them know that there is someone out there. Educate them, find them a person that they can share the information with and get out of the system. Ask, allow them plenty of time for them to share. They may not be ready to share their whole story. They may just be able to share a little bit about what's going on. And if they do, just respect the victim's choices of what they want to do or how they're going to respond to the information or the help that you're going to give them. And just let them know that you're concerned for them. And there are resources out there that can help them. So victims in our community, they may not self-identify, as we talked about earlier. Maybe they've been failed by the system, so they don't want to report. They've been programmed to fear law enforcement or to fear the system, so they don't want to come forward. Often based on kind of half-truths of what's going on, often combated or very fearful of submissive, typically suffering from maybe some trauma or some PTSD, and just that understanding, that ability to recall some of those experiences that are going on. So when we've identified someone, what are our next steps? What can we do? Some immediate needs to address is that sense of safety for them. They want that immediate help with their health and their safety. That's the first and foremost thing to do, is make sure that they're safe. Get them that help that they need. And then provide an environment that's safe for them to express their feelings, and then address those next steps of where to refer them. So when someone's identifying, figure out, I'm concerned for your safety, I'm concerned for your health, would go with you and help you get checked to make sure everything is okay. Once we can do that, then I can go with you to help figure out what your next steps are. Here's some tips and considerations that we got as advocates that I think it's great to share with the communities, is treat individuals as victims as they're going through, regardless of their potential prior criminal records. If they're seeking, we want to be there to provide that advocacy that they need and identify that there are going to be some barriers and concerns that need to be addressed. Just want to make sure that we can provide them with those basic needs. If there's any language barriers, to seek out resources that can help with that. If you have any questions with the citizenship or immigration, making sure you're finding those resources to be able to get those answers for them. And like we talked about, victims may not trust law enforcement. It is possible that they have all law enforcement parties present. If you can, some of them may not want to disclose. That's fine. You call the human trafficking hotline, you get them the best help that you can. But if someone is disclosing, try to be diligent in trying to find someone for them to be in contact with so that they can get ultimately out of the situation that they're in. So we don't want them to getting into any trafficking. We want them to be able to direct them in a more positive way of getting out. So where can we refer them? We can refer them to emergency services. We can refer them to safe housings. We do have temporary housing that we have here for emergencies, and that's where our partnership with Call to Freedom comes in, because if we were able to identify that they are human trafficking, we do call to Freedom in our area to have a case manager come and help them, either relocate them to their area, or they will come and case manage while they're staying here. To make sure that they get that mental health or the medical care that they need, being able to give them resources for legal assistance, and maybe they need some education or some job life skills. I put the information up here for the resources that are in our area. If you need other resources, you definitely can go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which we have talked about in the earlier slides, because there is other places in South Dakota, but these are the ones in our local area here that we work with. So those services are Call to Freedom. And then we have our shelter here. So I have the hotline and our website. And like I said, we are partners with the East River Human Trafficking Task Force. They have the national hotline number there, but we also do have a website for our Human Trafficking Task Force. But the number one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind, if there is something going on and you have concerns with human trafficking, and you don't know what to do and it's an immediate need, in an emergency, always call 911. But again, if it is human trafficking, you need that other help, I suggest reaching out to Call to Freedom, the national hotline, and they will refer you to the appropriate services and advocates that you would need to help answer the questions of what are next steps for someone that is in a human trafficking situation. And with that, that's all I have for our information on human trafficking. Does anyone have any questions?
And I can turn off the recording so that people feel more comfortable.